Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Center of Law and Society's annual lecture, which this year it will be delivered by the most distinguished academic colleague and friend, Kim Lane Scheppele from Princeton University. And Kim, to say just very few words, Kim is really one of those amazing scholars who keep on working in their field of research despite fashions, concepts being rolled out and changing, especially in constitutional theory. And Kim has this unique quality of absorbing all that is happening in constitutional world, in transnational law, in global law, and yet is fully focused on long-term interests, such as constitutional transformations, constitutionalism itself, democracy building, human rights, and she is author of many books. She was serving as president of the Law and Society Association between 2017 2019. She was awarded a number of academic awards, and as those of you who know Kim, you know they are very, very well deserved. And Kim is not just an academic, she is a public intellectual, which I know that here in Britain, if you call somebody a public intellectual, it's not necessarily a positive thing, but where we live or where we come from, and where we're heading, hopefully, public intellectuals will keep their important roles. So she is a critical public figure, known and praised by many in many countries, hated by some in some countries, but it's another of her credentials. And for these many reasons, I feel really, really happy today and privileged that Kim is with us to deliver her talk and her lecture on the future of authoritarian legalism. So, Kim, the floor is yours. You're co-hosting this lecture on Zoom, so I'm passing the floor and everything that comes with these online pleasures on to you. Thank you, Kim.
Great, thanks much, but I think you actually have to permit me to share my screen. I just realized that that wasn't, do you know how to do that? You just go down to share screen and then it's like multiple participants.
Yes, yes, it's, I'm on share screen and yeah.
Yeah, but it says that, oops, no, here we go. Let's, oh
Yeah.
yeah. Okay, but that's because you're sharing your screen, but I think I need to share my screen.
Okay.
You have to give me permission to do that. So if you go
allow
to
the record, rename, put in,
we practiced this yesterday,
we
actually, for
practiced
everybody on
yesterday,
the call.
but
So I realized I didn't check it till the minute you were introducing me, and then I saw. So I think you have to unshare your screen.
okay, all right. I'm stopping sharing the screen.
Yeah, and then if you go to share screen, just to the right of that, there should be a. Let's see, there should be a little way for you to permit multiple people to share screen.
Okay.
Because it says host has disabled screen sharing. It could be, I don't know, have you made me a co-host? No, so actually if you make me a co-host, that's another possibility.
Yes, you are a co-host.
Not listed as such.
Portion of screen, slides as virtual.
Sorry about that. Actually, while she's figuring that out, let me just say one thing, because Professor Pishpan mentioned that I follow current events. So today is actually a momentous day, and that is that it's the day that the European Union will dissolve itself. And the reason why this is going to happen is because some of you know that there's a threat now on the table. I mean, how to put it? It's going to dissolve itself in multiple ways. You guys are all dealing with Brexit, which is, I'm sure the biggest thing in your horizon. But there's also this little matter of the budget, which Hungary and Poland are trying to veto. I'm stalling for time while she figures that out. I can share my slides. And so what happened was yesterday, the German presidency came out with a compromise, so-called council conclusions that add a kind of exhortation to the rule of law conditionality that Hungary and Poland were trying to avoid. And it's the most remarkable thing. For those of you who've studied the EU, you'll understand why I said that the EU is about to dissolve itself. The Council, the European Council, which is not a lawmaking body in the EU, in these conclusions, if they adopt them, and it's on the agenda for this afternoon, will instruct the Commission not to enforce a regulation. And it will also instruct the EU to decide the case about whether the regulation complies with the treaties. And it will, it is basically taking over. And also the Parliament has said we're not reopening the question of this rule of law regulation. It will add to the regulation without modifying the regulation conditions to which the Parliament would never have agreed. And so, in other words, the European Council is just overriding all the institutions of the EU itself. So here we go. So now I can share my slides. So I just was using that as a way of saying, and yes, I follow current events while I was waiting for the screen share to come up. So so watch this space. There are a bunch of us who are spending today trying to at least slow this thing down, because the text was made, sort of half public yesterday, and without giving people time to mobilize. So if you have any questions about the EU budget and the state of the EU, also Brexit, which I follow, happy to talk about that. But the title of my talk for today is The Future of Autocratic Legalism. One thing I should say is that I've actually worked out a way to show slides and see you all. So if, so I love it when some of you at least have your cameras on, because I love the sense that I'm actually talking to somebody, because I can in fact see you. This is not a mandate to turn a camera on, but also a way of saying, don't all turn your cameras off, because then I'll feel like I'm just talking to my screen here. All right, so what am I talking about? So many of you will know at least the idea behind this picture, which is this idea that we are always going to move toward more and more and more democracies in the world. This is a chart that shows the last, century and a decade, or at least from 1901 to 2009, the march of democratic progress. And green, what you see on the left is the scale of the number of people in the world who live under regimes of different kinds. And what the chart shows is that there's been this constant expansion of the number of democracies in the world, but in particular, the proportion of the world's population that live under democratic regimes. Green is democracy. Black is colonialism, it disappears. The various forms of orange are various forms of authoritarianism, that it gets held at bay, and democracy simply expands. So that's the story that a lot of us have been teaching and telling ourselves and feeling very proud about. And this is backed up by a lot of political science work, and in particular, Al Stepan and Juan Linz, who were, some of the leading transitologists in the 1990s, as those of us who work on Eastern Europe called them. And political scientists basically believe this line, which is that it was possible for a regime to become what Linz and Stepan called a consolidated democracy. And a consolidated democracy is, as they put it here, a political regime in which democracy as a complex system of institutions, rules, and patterned incentives and disincentives has become, in a phrase, the only game in town, right? So they would call something a consolidated democracy when essentially there was no challenger to democracy, when it was all there was on the horizon. And moreover, they said, when you get to this end state, it's sort of like every other theory of progress, from Kant to Hegel to Marx, et cetera. You get to the end stage and you're so happy you never want to go back, right? So when the situation obtains, the behavior of this newly elected government that has emerged from democratic transition is no longer dominated by the problem of how to avoid democratic breakdown, right? So the assumption, the sort of untested assumption, was that this march of democratic progress led to a bunch of countries becoming democracies from which there was no return. right? That once a country was established and consolidated, that was the end of history. In fact, the phrase "the end of history" was something that was bandied about at that time. And now, unfortunately, in fact, since that chart ends, so since about 2010, actually it starts a little bit earlier, but accelerating since 2010, we're now seeing something that might be called the March of Democratic Regress. So the glory days of constitutional government sort of hit their peak around 2010, and constitutional government around the world is now declining. So constitutional governments themselves, as well as other, hybrid forms, are recording lower indicators of democratic health and civil liberties. And we're seeing the collapse, including of consolidated democracies, into autocracy. Okay, so here's a chart that shows you how to think about this. I suppose this is the Varieties of Democracy project, which I think has some of the best sort of measures of this stuff. On the left, what you see is a chart that shows you the number of countries moving in different directions. And on the right, you see a chart that shows you the percentage of the world's population living under regimes of different kinds. Okay, so the blue line are all the countries moving in a democratic direction, that where their scores from year to year show that they're getting more democratic, more protective of civil liberties, more protective of separation of powers and independent checking institutions, et cetera. And on that's on the left is the number of countries. And so you see the blue line, it goes up until about 2000, and then it goes down. And that's when the red line, which are the countries that are moving in an autocratic direction, undermining checks and balances, undermining separation of powers, starting to infringe civil liberties, starting to infringe the independence of the judiciary, those countries start going up. So it's numbers of countries on the left. And then you see on the right, the percentage of the world's population living under autocratic or autocratizing regimes in which each year brings fewer protections for constitutional democracy. That has just taken off since 2010. This is an easier way to think about it. So, from a minuscule fraction of the world's population that was living in countries moving in the wrong direction, we're now up to about a third of the world's population living in countries that are moving in an autocratizing direction. Okay, so this is really huge. Here's another, it says a lot of information on this chart, but it's actually pretty simple. So this is a chart, again, Varieties of Democracy. They have this liberal democracy indicator. The chart shows along the bottom axis, along the horizontal axis, the scores ranging from 0, which is really bad, to 1, which is perfect, sort of adherence to liberal and democratic constitutionalism. And on the vertical axis, it's that same score only 10 years later. So the way to read this, the reason why the chart's nifty, is that if a country stays on the line, it hasn't changed. If it's above the line, it's getting better. And if it's below the line, it's getting worse. And basically how much worse it's getting is measured by how far away from the line it is, right? So basically you look at this chart and what you realize is that this is what's behind. This is the question of so who's backsliding? And the answer is a lot of countries. And what's interesting is if you take the line in the middle, if you sort of cut the liberal democracy line in half, so countries that are in the top, half of the scores, almost all the movement is down from the top, right? So that, I think, is one of the more interesting, challenges in this graph. It's the countries we used to think were out of danger that are the ones that are backsliding even further, faster than the ones farther down. All right. And then, this is the first proof that Stepan and Linz were wrong. So the first country to be, this is Freedom House indicators now as opposed to VDEM, but they sort of roughly track each other. Hungary became the first country in 2015 to move from being classified as a consolidated democracy to being classified as green line here, to being classified as a semi-consolidated democracy, and last year moved into the category of transitional or hybrid regime, what Levitsky and Way called competitive authoritarianism. So it's possible. Hungary is now the classic case, and it's sort of the most extreme, but Poland is moving right along with it. And you could do, Turkey, which started from a lower level, Venezuela, which completely collapsed. There are a number of countries now that were pretty consolidated democracies that now are really not, and they're not even democracies of any kind. So this is, are democratic governments failing? It's clear that they are. But what's fascinating to me and what this talk is about is that they're failing in ways that were not predicted by Stepan and Linz, right? So first of all, the governments that are falling most dramatically are these things that we used to think of as consolidated democracies, right? And Linz and Stepan told us that would never happen. So it's happening. So that's interesting because political scientists didn't predict it. But the more interesting part, and this is what I'm really going to focus on today, is that these regimes are failing in reality, but they're not failing in theory. So what do I mean by that? Most of these governments that are engaged in massive democratic backsliding are actually at great pains to say they're not doing that, which is to say, it's not like they're saying, hooray for competitive authoritarianism, it's a superior form of government. They're all trying to pretend to still be constitutional democracies. And that tells you that normatively, that's still the only game in town. But practically speaking, it's being undermined at every turn, right? So it's still an ideal model. It's just, so there's a difference between the reality and the aspiration. And so this group of autocrats, the people who were steering their governments away from democratic governance into these competitive authoritarian regimes. And by the way, one of the characteristics of a competitive authoritarian regime is that the electorate can't get rid of the government if it wants to. So they're sort of nominally competitive elections, but everyone knows who's going to win, right? So that's one of the characteristics. And what's interesting here is that these legalists, these autocrats are now touting their adherence to constitutional norms, and often also touting their adherence, if not to standard liberal constitutional democracy, then some form of constitutional democracy. And so I call these folks legalistic autocrats because very often the way that they dismantle democracy is precisely by doing it through law. So as I've said in some of my writings, what we see, are coups that are happening not because the guys in power call out the military, right? It's not tanks in the street. It's lawyers in the street, right? It's phalanxes of lawyers who are accomplishing this. And that's a very different kind of disintegration of democratic governance than we've seen before. All right, so just a little terminology, because I think it's important to think about not just democratic constitutionalism as a thing, but democracy and constitutionalism as two pieces of government that need to work together. And so and I argue with my democratic theory colleagues here at Princeton quite a lot about this. So I'm defining a democracy as a political system in which leaders are accountable to an electorate. Okay, and obviously when you get to the point where electorates can't change their leaders, then you no longer have a democratic system. But I also want to say that there's a separate set of concerns that are raised by the concept of constitutionalism, which is a political legal system in which leaders and the electorates are additionally accountable to constitutional principles, in addition to being accountable to the sort of rotation of power. And these can be sort of rights-based dignity, liberty checks, or they can be structural checks, so checks on executive power and so on. And so a constitutional democracy combines both of these things. And what we're now seeing is these two concepts being hollowed out kind of separately, but they're hollowed out in such a way that they come apart. So, and what we're now seeing is that, of course, every country that is a democratic backslider still has elections. They still even have elections that look competitive. It's just that the other guys can't win, and that the ones who are in power govern under a constitution in which in which the leaders purport to be following the constitution. But either, as in Hungary, a case I'll talk about in a minute, the constitution can be changed overnight to accommodate what the leaders want to do, or the leaders simply appear to follow the constitution while doing something else. So how do these legalistic autocrats, as I call them, work? And again, I'm writing a whole book on this. So parts of this, like there's one slide that's like a whole chapter. So this is one of those slides. And so what happens, and what I've discovered in sort of looking, like these are just some of the autocrats I study, Viktor Orban, and then Mr. Kaczynski, Mr. Putin, Mr. Erdogan, but also, I've been looking at, Venezuela, Ecuador under Correa. Some governments kind of go to the edge, pull back, some don't. I'm looking now a lot at India. I'm starting to look at Israel. There are a number of countries where you see this kind of phenomenon happening. And what's interesting is how much these things follow a script, okay? So the first thing is that the autocrats that do this are all elected. And they're very often elected the first time in a free and fair election with hearty political support. So I don't want to take away from them the fact that they actually do come to power the first time in usually a free and fair election. But and there's two versions of this. Either as soon as they come to power, they change the constitution. So see Viktor Orban, see Hugo Chavez, see Correa and Ecuador and so forth. Or there's actually a second slow burn version, which is like Turkey and Russia, where Erdogan and Putin were elected, and it took 5 to 10 years into their term before they made the major constitutional changes. But in any event, the crucial thing is that these autocrats operate through law to remove checks on their power, either suddenly or gradually. They have specific targets, so it's not just a general change of all the laws, but they make key institutions politically dependent. So the judiciary, the media, and the civil sector, because those are the three that really can unsettle their rule, and they go after those first. Usually the judiciary is sort of the first target, followed by consolidation of media and the NGO sphere. If you've been following developments in Poland, the government there has concentrated primarily on undermining the independence of the judiciary. But just in the last couple of weeks, they've sort of tipped their hand at how they're going to consolidate the media, and they're starting to harass the NGOs as well. Okay. Next step, so is appointments, crucial appointments in particular key roles. Again, not every single role, but particularly the prosecutor, the election office, the tax authority, the audit office, and the whatever entity selects the judges. Those are the ones which are usually subject to packing with party loyalists. And sometimes that means getting rid of the current incumbents in unconventional ways. But by the end of a first term in office, these autocrats have gotten those offices sort of under their control. And then in their first term of office, what do? They rewrite the election laws so that the second election is not as free and fair as the first one. Sometimes the second election is already, the election laws are so rigged that the opposition can't win. And sometimes it's a little bit more gradual. Also, they've changed the media laws, so the media become very shy about criticizing the government for what it's doing because they know they face huge fines or some other kind of administrative sanction. And then they want certain judges in place, particularly in key positions, so that if there are challenges to the elections, the judges are there to ensure that the election goes to the autocrat. And all this while, the autocrats delegitimate the political opposition. So they don't just say we have program A, they have program B, our program's better. That's normal democratic politics. They say we are the true representatives of this country and they are all foreign stooges, or they don't belong here, or they are not true fill in the blank, Hungarians, Americans, Poles, whatever. So it's an attempt to say the opposition shouldn't be there, which is very different than just tolerating normal democratic contestation. So by the time all these stages are gone through, and very often it happens in the first term of an elected government, the second election has a logical outcome, which is these folks get reelected. And by the third term, many of the pretenses of democratic government are gone. So this is kind of the script that they follow. So what we're finding is that these legalistic autocrats are now engineering what I call constitutional coups. And they're constitutional because they follow all the rules, so that they're elected, and then there's changes in laws. And that's what normal governments do, right? You elect somebody, and what do they want to do? They want to put in different policies. So of course they're going to change the law. And the Constitution, in many cases, or crucial laws themselves, become the vehicle through which the autocrat consolidates power. So that's why so many of these folks are lawyers. So I always want to say, particularly in Eastern Europe, the part of the world that Professor Prizman and I specialize in, Putin's a lawyer, Kaczynski's a lawyer, Orban's a lawyer. Like, just a lot of these guys have been lawyers. And if they're not, they've got a close circle of lawyers who are laundering all this stuff. So one thing I say when I'll get to the end about what is to be done, one thing I say is we got to be careful about how we train lawyers, because if they're the engineers of all of this, you got to teach them when you got the chance that there's an ethical obligation that goes with being a lawyer. Okay, so the law becomes this vehicle. And again, if you look at the content of the laws, you can't do this without looking at the content of laws. Checks and balances are removed by law. The laws are aimed at removing constraints on the discretion of the executive. Full stop. That's really how this works. And so you can find laws across a huge variety of different topics, but they'll have that in common if this is going on. And it's a coup. So all that's constitutional, right? Because all that's legal. If they do it well, every single step is legal. So it's even difficult for example, a constitutional court, if they haven't already packed it, to find that there's a problem because they follow all the formalities. But it's a coup if at the end of this process, the electorate can no longer get rid of the leader, right? And that will happen step by step as all of this kind of stuff goes on. So these are autocrats that are undermining democratic and constitutional accountability. Okay, so now how do they get away with it? I have an article called The Frankenstein, which has generated some attention because I think it's a catchy phrase, but it's meant to actually be an analytic concept. So if you think about, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, the monster that Dr. Frankenstein builds, he builds because he goes out and digs up graves at night, right? And then he attaches like an arm from one body to a leg from another body, etc. That's the metaphor I want you to keep in mind. These were once normal bodies, and they're turned into a monster by the way that they're combined. Okay, so that the way that this happens, legally speaking, is that, and in fact, the Hungarians and the Poles just formed an institute for doing this kind of work formally. They've been doing it secretly for some time, but now there's a formal institute. What they do is they scour the landscape. They look to good democracies, and they either find their worst practices, because every democracy's got those, right? Or they find good practices that, when combined with another good practice from elsewhere, generate a kind of interaction effect that makes things terrible. Okay. Because then when the government's criticized, they say, oh, well, this is just like what Denmark does, right? Or this is just like what, some other, the Hungarians for a while were saying, when the Finns were in the rotating presidency, how dare the Finns criticize us? They don't even have a constitutional court. So it's stuff like this, right, where you use the variation in constitutional systems as a way of justifying the variation you happen to have chosen, but it creates this constitutional monster. So you're seeing now the spread of these kind of worst practices, right? These tools that are circulating that start in, maybe they're the worst practices of a good democracy, or they might even be perfectly fine, and they circulate. Let me give you a couple of examples. So let me start with the US, which is a good model for bad practices. We've given gerrymandering to the world, for example. But one of the things the US did, I'm sorry, it's a busy slide. I'm happy to give you slides afterwards. I put so much stuff on that slide so that if you go back and look at them, you can remember what happened during that slide. But in 1938, the US passed something called the Foreign Agents Registration Act. This is at the height of, worry about communism, entry into the war, worried about all kinds of, foreign influences that were going to affect the sort of US war effort and so forth. And this law requires all NGOs and lobbyists that have foreign backing to register themselves and disclose all their foreign funding. Okay, so it's not a liberal law, right? And it's never really much been enforced until the Trump years. But anyway, so this law has been in place. It made almost no effect in the operation of the civil sector in the US, which has so many NGOs and so much civil sector activity that this hit this very tiny slice. So it didn't really affect the overall health of the democracy, even if it's an illiberal law. So Russia realized, because actually Russia was getting hit with some of these cases, Russia in 2012 adopted almost the identical law, saying any NGO, that is involved in politics has got to register and disclose their funding. They almost exactly copied the US law. Okay, now the problem is in Russia, the civil sector was all the oppositional civil sector was almost entirely funded from outside, right? And so here you borrow the same law and you've got this different context, and it just shuts down, demonizes, and marginalizes all the oppositional civil sector, including, because the difference between 1938 and 2012 is that you suddenly have, not suddenly, but over that time, there's an international human rights community that has grown with far-reaching, international organizations with national chapters. And these laws go after those groups, right? So when this passed in Russia, it has the effect of closing down many of the oppositional groups that were operating in Russia. So that was so successful. So then Israel passed almost the same law. Hungary's passed the same law. Now India just passed the same law, right? And they all say, well, look, the US has this. So what's wrong with it? Right? So by Frankenstein, I mean to say you take this law, you put it in a different context, right? Here you've got very few oppositional groups operating without foreign funding. So when you put the same law in this different context, it has this different effect. I'll give you one more example, and then I'm going to skip some slides because I'm talking too much. But here's another one. So when the Hungarian government decided it wanted to take over the judiciary, it did so in this context in which many states were thinking about extending the judicial retirement age. So many countries have had pretty rigid retirement ages, as the immediate post-war generation, which is huge, have neared pension age, and everybody can see that pension systems are under stress. This has put some pressure on eliminating or extending retirement ages. And so many countries said, okay, if the retirement age is 65, now it will be 70, or maybe we'll get rid of the retirement age altogether. And nobody thought of that as a violation of the independence of the jobs that were so affected, right? You tell the judge, okay, you have to retire at 65 and now it's at 70, up to you. No infringement on judicial independence. So the Hungarians said, well, must be that the retirement age doesn't affect independence. So what we're going to do is we're going to lower it. Okay, and they lowered the judicial retirement age from 70 to 62. Okay, and their justification was everybody who was affected had gotten their degrees under communism, and we want to get rid of all those communist judges. And besides, we want to bring in a young, new, lively group of lawyers, who are much more trained. They know EU law. They've been, all this stuff. We're going to renew the judiciary, right? All great. Okay, now the problem is that when you do that, it's a civil service judiciary in Hungary, as in most countries outside the common law world. What does that mean? It means you get rid of, they got rid of 15% of the judiciary, but it was 30% of the Supreme Court. It was 80% of the court presidents. Because in a civil service judiciary, people rise to the top over a career, and you lop off the most senior people, and suddenly the government has all these new judgeships to fill, and it's a way of just capturing the courts overnight. This happened in 2011 in Hungary. The Court of Justice eventually said, no, you can't do this. But it was after Orban had already filled all the judgeships, and then he turns to the Court of Justice and says, oh, so do you want us to fire all these judges? Right, to which the EU will, of course, say, no, we don't believe in firing judges. Instead, we want you to give them, we want you to increase the retirement age again, So now Orban's judges are in with an extended term. That's the effect. Okay, so this was so successful that Mohamed Morsi did it in Egypt a year later. And actually what's interesting is that I have documentation of all these trips between the Hungarian Justice Ministry and the Egyptian Justice Ministry. And they were literally consulting back and forth on how do you do this. And Mohamed Morsi put this into effect just before he was deposed, so the whole thing didn't go through. But here's Viktor Orban, Mr. Islamophobe of Europe, right? Working with the Muslim Brotherhood president of Egypt to undermine. You will see later, I don't think ideology counts for much in all of this. So it happens in Egypt. And then, of course, Poland does the same thing in 2017. It's been sort of beaten back by the Court of Justice because they've learned something. But here, too, it's like, what's wrong with changing the retirement age, right? That wasn't something anyone had flagged as a possible infringement on judicial independence. But if you have a civil service judiciary, it has these effects. I'll give you one more example. So court packing. So how else do you take over a judiciary? Well, court packing. So, Franklin Roosevelt, the US president, again in 1937, tried to do this with the US Supreme Court. The effort was beaten back. It's always given as a model for how not to deal with the judiciary. So if a government now tries to engage in court packing, everybody will say, no, that's illegitimate, right? Like that, red flags, and everybody criticizes it. So how does a government pack a court without raising red flags? Well, this is where Mr. Erdogan in Turkey figured out a strategy. So first, what he did was got through the parliament a law that gave the Constitutional Court the power to hear what the Germans would call constitutional complaints, right? So tons of sort of relatively minor, not to the person, but in the grand scheme of constitutional government, tons and tons, thousands of minor cases suddenly flooded to the Turkish Constitutional Court. And everybody said, this is great. Erdogan is giving another avenue for the realization of human rights. This is actually when Turkey was on a glide path to possibly entering the EU. It was considered a great reform. And then Erdogan turns around and says, wow, all those judges at the Constitutional Court are so overworked. They have so many cases. We have to add more judgeships to this court, which now has this new docket. So suddenly the Turkish Constitutional Court, increased by a third, and Erdogan got all those appointments. And everybody said, oh, great, he's supporting the Constitutional Court. He's not undermining the Constitutional Court. That's why I'm saying these are, so that succeeded. Basically, there was a little bit of criticism because people knew who the judges were. But, basically Erdogan got away with it. So then the next year, Viktor Orban does it. And here too, Mr. Islamophobe Orban, goes to Muslim majority Turkey. And, there, again, these trips between the justice ministries, you can see them working on this stuff. Then Viktor Orban does the same thing in Hungary and gets away with it. Okay, so you can see that there are these ideas that you can see how they can be justified in an international space, but when applied locally, they have these particularly devastating effects. So this is the kind of Frankenstein problem that you build the monster out of familiar body parts, but when it acts as in the new context, it becomes a monster. So this is now the public face of autocracy. Hungary is advertising dental tourism. Poland had all these trucks traveling around the EU saying during World War II, Poles saved over 100,000 Jews. I mean, so they're putting forward this human rights friendly face, or like, we are safe. We are the great destination for tourism. Look at how beautiful Budapest is, right? So this is not your old fashioned authoritarianism in which you would never in a million years really want to go visit these countries that had tanks in the streets, right? So this keeps the country looking to the external world like a rights respecting constitutional democracy when it isn't. Okay, so why is this happening? So the standard explanation for why democracies are failing all over the world is, well, you just walk into a bookstore and this is what you see, right? So populism, this is the problem. And then you see the explanations are kind of the same in every country. They rotate among these. Well, there's all these discontent people who have been left behind by economic change, or there are people swimming in a sea of fake news, or there are people who are, afraid of terrorism or afraid of threats to their identity. There's an anger at old elites, or it's just plain racism. So you find all this, blame the people. In some of my, writing on this, I've been, quoting Bertolt Brecht, who says that obviously the people should be dissolved and we should elect another, right? So that's kind of the goal here, because if all these autocrats are elected, it must mean that that people wanted these bad things. Okay, so I want to argue that actually populism is not what's driving this. And I think we get, as an academic community, I mean, it's important to counter the kinds of hateful things that populists say. And there's populism of the left and populism of the right, and people are like doing typologies of populism. They can do that. That's not what I'm doing here. But just to say that what gets a lot of people excited is what leaders say. And what I want to focus on is what leaders do. And I think that there's a real difference between the two. What I'm going to argue today is that populist ideology is a cover that distracts from constitutional destruction, and that the two don't necessarily go together, except insofar as you would need a distraction to do constitutional destruction, because the people who vote for these folks don't want constitutional destruction. So basically, these are not the same things. So let me just give you a little bit of public opinion data to show how these things come apart. So this is the Pew Research Center does this annual global attitude survey. And this is I picked the results from 2016 because this was the year the US elected Donald Trump. And what's so interesting is everybody says, well, the US has just become populist by electing Trump. This is the standard sort of question that measures sort of right-wing populism, or the appeal of right-wing populism. Do you think that having an increasing number of people of many different races, ethnic groups, and nationalities makes the country a better place to live, a worse place to live, or doesn't make much of a difference? So the worst place to live is the populist answer. And the US in the year that Donald Trump came to power had basically very few people who said that. Okay, so that wasn't probably what was going on. What you see, these are all, I just picked up the numbers here for Europe, and the countries that had the largest number of populists, Greece, which, by the way, had a left-wing government at that time, right? You see Poland and Hungary kind of right up there. So, but not majorities, at any place here except Italy and Greece. And my favorite surprising finding here is, look at the Netherlands, a model of constitutional democracy in other ways. So this slide is just to show you that support for that particular populist view is not really correlated with the countries that you think of as the trouble cases and the non-trouble cases. Here's another chart. So this is direct support for autocracy. This is from the next year because they didn't ask this question in the same year. This is from 2017. would a system in which a strong leader can make decisions without interference from the parliament or the courts be a good or bad way of running the country? That's the constitutional destruction question, right? And what you see is that very little support anywhere for this. More support in Italy than you'd like to see. And by the way, the UK, just so you know. But still, none of these are working majorities that would tilt an election, right? It's vanishingly small numbers as public opinion results go for supporting that. So you'll see populism, support for intolerance sort of comes and goes, but it doesn't seem to be heavily correlated on a country basis with this sort of constitutional destruction question. Okay, so then the question is, what are voters voting for when they vote for the populists and they get autocracy? And this is where I'm engaged in a project. I'm only partway through it. I'll give you one example. I may skip my second example to just say, like, so what are voters voting for? I think what we have to do is roll the clock back and ask, at that first free and fair election, when the person who's going to become an autocrat comes to power, what were voters voting for? And that means looking at the choices that voters had and asking, what exactly was going on in that pivotal election, because we know with the subsequent elections, they're starting to be rigged, right? That's the characteristic of this kind of system. So, Hungary is always my favorite case. So here's some, again, Pew Global Research survey data. This is the year that Viktor Orban is elected. And they asked, this is all the so-called East European countries. So are you satisfied with democracy? Okay, so the Hungarians were like, no. And part of that's because Hungarians always answer negatively on every poll, because as Professor Bridgman and I were talking about yesterday, it's what attracted me to Hungary. The favorite kids book there, Mici Macko, is Winnie the Pooh in translation. And the most prominent character in the Hungarian version is Eeyore. Okay, so if you just think of that as a marker for other things, it's a very good cultural indicator. Anyway, Hungarians were depressed, but they had a good reason to be depressed, because when the financial crisis hit in 2008, Hungary was hit hardest and first. The IMF came in early 2009, bailed Hungary out, put in a caretaker government, and they were living under an austerity budget because the prior government, which was corrupt and overspent and screwed up the public accounts, had basically fallen apart. Okay, so this is the year of the election. So, Hungarians were unhappy. They were going to vote to change their government. Like when you see numbers like this, you always know the other side will win the next election. Okay, so, but look at this. This is from the same survey. So how important are democratic institutions and freedoms? How important are fair judiciary, multi-party elections, et cetera? And when you sort of take the average of all of these scores, the Hungarians wind up on top in Eastern Europe, right? As in commitment to constitutional institutions. Okay, so they're unhappy, but they don't want to crash their governments, right? So what happened? So this is the pivotal election, 2010. Viktor Orban comes to power. His campaign, he was campaigning against austerity and against corruption. It was a completely unremarkable campaign. He never said he would, seize power, rewrite the Constitution, and do all the things he did. And if you look at the other parties that were running in 2010, basically Hungary had become by that time a two-party system, alternating between sort of parties of the right, parties of the left, with a couple of small parties on the margins. The socialists were the ones on whose watch the whole country had just fallen apart, so they were not going to win. Orban's the leading sort of mainstream alternative. There was this little party called LMP, which was youthful. It was a youthful group and nobody knew what they stood for, kind of liberal, kind of green. And then there was the neo-Nazi party, right? So when this election happened, I was just thrilled there wasn't more support for the neo-Nazis, right? Orban gets 53% of the vote. But I must admit that if I had been voting in that election, not a populist and a committed constitutionalist, I might have voted for Orban. Just there were not good choices, right? So what did voters vote for when they voted for Orban? He had been prime minister already once. And yes, it was a conservative government, but it didn't throw the country out of the field of democratic countries. You would not have guessed, unless you knew Orban well, what was going to happen. And then this is a little spaghetti chart. This is I'm sorry, it's in Hungarian, but it's the popularity of different political parties, and orange is Orban's party. And what you see, he's elected here sort of at the peak of his popularity. And note, the peak of his popularity was 45%. Orban's popularity usually is in the 30s. It's been in the 30s kind of ever since he was elected. So here at the peak of his popularity, he gets elected. As soon as he comes into power, he immediately wants to rewrite the Constitution, immediately starts capturing institutions, and his popularity drops below 20% during the time when it's most evident that he's consolidating and capturing power, which is to say, that's not what Hungarians wanted. And then what happens? He discovers populism and he starts talking, all the stuff you now associate with Orban, all of his illiberal democracy stuff starts here, and it becomes the distraction from everything he's doing. He also does things like lower electricity fees and, increase pensions and stuff like that. So by the time of the second election, he wins again. And you can see that all the other parties are like in the, not doing well. So then the question is, why don't people vote for the Gray Party? Okay, and this is the really interesting thing to me about Hungary. Gray are the people who say none of the above, which is to say you've got a party system in which the dominant party is we want something else than what's on offer. The party system is really failing Hungarians. And that profile, I want to say, is one of the things you see in countries that go through democratic collapse. And now they're in a state where they can't change their government through elections. Okay, I'm running out of time, so I'm not going to talk about Venezuela, where I think the same thing happened. But the crucial thing I just want to say here is that the onset of autocracy could not have been predicted by voters, and they were not voting for that. And as soon as they start to see it, their support for the regime fades. But by the time it fades, it becomes too late because of this autocratic takeover. So therefore, I think, it's not populism. So let me end with this thought, because I promised to tell you something about the future of all of this. So why is this happening in so many places at once, right? Because I showed you at the beginning, this is not just Hungary. Voters are in many countries facing elections in which they have no good choices. And there's a little thing that shows you why parties are collapsing all over the place. The chart on the left shows you, for a variety of European countries, the percentage of the population that belongs to any party, and it's obviously been going down. The chart on the right, actually the brown line is the most interesting one. It shows you measured against the right hand scale. That shows you the number of parties that get more than 1% of the vote in European elections. This is across all European countries. So you see this splintering of the political spectrum, and you see party membership going down and party affiliation really going down. There are lots of things that go wrong with parties. I won't go through everything, but basically the parties are having internal fights. They can't get rid of the same old faces, that voters are kind of fed up with all of their choices and with all of the parties. So they vote for something else. So my argument here is that you can get rogue leaders without rogue voters. And that's because at election time, people are often voting for the best of a bad set of choices. And if parties are falling apart, they're falling apart and they're failing at their gatekeeping function of keeping dangerous candidates from going before the public. People might think that the parties are saying, well, geez, if this traditional party puts up this guy, must be okay. But that's what's not happening when parties start to fall apart. The parties are broken. And why are the parties broken? The parties are broken because I think we're seeing a kind of once in a couple 100-year shift from a political spectrum that had been organized along a left-right continuum, sort of the economic left, economic right. We all know intuitively what that means. But increasingly, we're seeing that voters are identifying themselves, here it's labeled populism, but I'd say a kind of scale that goes from nationalism to cosmopolitanism. Are you safer with people of your kind close to home? Or do you want to see yourself as a citizen with lots of opportunities in the world? Are values local or global? All those kinds of things. That's now the political spectrum that you see dominating the debate in a lot of countries, but it's happening in a field where the parties are still arrayed from left to right. And so what that does is it creates civil wars inside the parties of the left between this, Britain, right? What were the Tories up to, in putting forward the Brexit question? It was the civil war in the Tory party that did that between the cosmopolitans, pro-Europeans, and the nationalists, right? And we could say Donald Trump is the nationalist wing of the Republican Party of the US. You can go through all the troubled countries, and basically what you find is that there's civil wars in the parties of the left and civil wars in the parties of the right. between the cosmopolitan and nationalist factors. And that's one of the things that's really tearing up parties. So my argument is that actually party collapse precedes democratic collapse. And that's why this is happening in so many places at once, because there really is a different kind of political ideology coming on the scene that the party system hasn't adapted to. So what is to be done? So Lenin's question, but not Lenin's answer. Okay, so this is the future of autocratic legalism. How do we get over this? So weirdly, I think we need more and better parties that recognize this new political spectrum. Elections need to offer better choices to voters. Voters do not want to crash their constitutional systems. They are susceptible to populist appeals sometimes, but really the problem is choices of candidates. How do you get new parties? Well, we have a different, and if you know Peter Mayer's work on ruling the void, he shows you how the history of political parties goes from being basically social groups that generate political wings to being sort of arms of the state, and so if political parties are now arms of the state with public funding and so on, then they need to be regulated. So, one of the things I'm working on right now, this is the German basic law section on political parties. Probably many of you know that in Germany, you can ban political parties that have anti-constitutional ideologies. Doesn't happen. It's not a very useful provision. The more useful provision of this article on political parties is the part highlighted in red in item number 1, which is parties themselves have to be organized along democratic lines. And what you find very often with these autocrats is that they've either staged a hostile takeover of their own party and frozen out of fraction, or they've created a kind of cult opportunity in which the leader has, basically taken over a party and it's not run democratically anymore. So if we think about parties as being like staging grounds for democracy, we have to think about how to reproduce constitutional structures sort of within parties. And so we need to work on parties as part of constitutional design. They have to learn how to participate in the formation of political will. They have to keep them tracking what publics want, and we have to keep them from disintegrating and fulfilling their gatekeeping functions. And so basically what we have to do is to say that voters can't vote for democracy, for constitutional democracy, if it's not on offer. And if all political campaigns look like this, then we're in trouble. So that's it. Thanks so much. And you're muted. You're still muted. Oh no, you're still muted.
Okay, yeah.
There you go. Okay, hooray.
Thank you very much, Kim. That's been absolutely terrific. And I didn't realize I'm muted. And so instead of long clapping, all these icons popping up here, we're extremely grateful. And it was illuminating exercise in almost constitutional ethnography. And another great thing about Kim Lane Scheppele is that unlike so many of her colleagues from the US who start talking about general constitutional issues, and in 5 minutes they switch to the US matters and start talking about US politics, she mentioned Donald Trump only once. And she got away with it, to use the classic Basil Fawlty catchphrase. So it's been a tour de force of comparative legalist autocracy, and that is emerging in the world. And I want to suggest the following, rather than, because there's too many of us for asking questions spontaneously. So I would like to invite you to put your name in the chat, and I will ask you and to unmute and ask the question or make a comment or whatever you might want to add to this gathering. So please start using the chat function. And meanwhile, I would like to just ask one question about this whole constitutional democracy backsliding, which is you didn't highlight the problem of democracy as equality. And in many of those countries, actually, it was the rise of populism, or the rise of this autocracy was initiated by a complete distrust in former elites, as you pointed out, but at the same time, at the growing difference between life opportunities of some and actually despair of the others. Like the story of Poland in this respect would be pretty illustrating. A successful country, no recession, nevertheless, the growing new inequalities. So my question would be, how much do you believe that actually this rise of constitutional autocracy or legalist autocracy is also the consequence of disenchantment with democratic state building?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. And, Poland is such a great example. So one thing that happens, it happens everywhere, but it happened a lot I always put Eastern Europe in quotes, right? Because we don't have a new name for the whole thing, is that there were a lot of leaders who came to power who had been part of the democratic opposition to communism. And when they came onto the political scene, they thought they were the natural leaders of this country, and they never left, right? So, I mean, I lived in Hungary through the 90s, and then I went back again, after Orban started doing all of this. And I had been gone for 10 years working on other things and living in other countries. And I was amazed that I still knew everybody who was in politics, right? And it's the same thing in Poland, where, the civic platform had been, one of the main platforms for a particular wing of the Solidarity movement. And the same people were there, right? So one of the dilemmas, and this goes to party dysfunction, right, is that a sane party rotates its leadership. So you get new generations, you get new perspectives, you have an opportunity for people to be, sort of in touch with a broader public and responsive to their needs. So what you see when you get these ossified parties that have the same people running them for decades is that, of course, they get out of touch with what people care about. So the anger against elites, which is usually identified with populism, I want to put down to party ossification, which voters are absolutely right to rise up against, right? I mean, democracy has to be self-renewing, and yet you often get these leaders who stay there. So my husband grew up in the Soviet Union, and when he moved to the US with me in the late 90s, he said, "Are there any families in the US other than Bushes and Clintons?" Right? Because you were seeing this, father Bush, son Bush, husband Bush, wife, husband Clinton, wife Clinton. So, it was sort of these political dynasties that had taken over the parties. And what you see are people really reacting against that because they want new choices, So this is where I just want to pull back and remain a structuralist on this and not just think that it's the people's fault, and I'm sure many people on this call have had this experience too, right? When was the last time you ever voted really enthusiastically for a candidate? Right? I mean, you vote because it's okay. It's a traditional party. If you're in the elites, the people or whatever, but real enthusiasm comes very rarely. And that's why, like, when the US got Barack Obama, it was like he won with the biggest majority ever because he was something really new, So anyway, so I think that's the problem. So is it about equality? Yes, but it's about elites getting out of touch because of party dysfunction. Sorry, it's a long answer.
No. Thank you
We have
very
some
much,
other questions now.
There are more questions coming. And Tilman Altenberg, if I just invite you to ask your question, it is in the chat, but I think you can ask directly now if you unmute yourself, please.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm more than happy to do that. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Uh-huh.
Yes, I'm not a political scientist, so please forgive me if my question sounds naive. If I understood you correctly, and I'm reading my own question here, you said that voters tend to turn away from autocratic leaders once they realize what they're up to. How exactly do these autocrats manage to be re-elected time after time? More specifically, how exactly do they rig the elections? That's the term you used, and it's widely used. And one case in point would be Putin. Putin, how does he manage to get re-elected if there actually are elections, and I presume people actually can go to the ballot and then cast their ballot? So how does he manage to still win the elections if, as you say, people understand what's going on and are actually turning against him?
Yeah, I know, it's such a good question. So, just specifically what happened in Russia was that they changed the rules about political parties. So it used to be that you could get elected to the Duma as an independent representative. And then after the independents in the Duma started raising trouble for Putin, they changed the rules, saying that everybody elected to the Duma has to run on a party list. And moreover, everyone has to run on a party list that is listed in, I think it was 52 of the 89 regions. There were 89 then, I think there's 87 now, but anyway. And what that meant was that all the liberals got excluded because the liberals only have traction in Moscow and St. Petersburg. And they got rid of all the liberals in the parliament by purporting to generalize the parties. And after that, Putin's had no real competition, so that was one thing. Orban changed the rules in more complicated, elaborate ways, but part of it is making it very difficult for the opposition parties to function. So one rule that just is getting adopted this week in Hungary, for example, you saw that kind of what the landscape looks like. It's big Fidesz and then all these little parties, right? And the parties are the neo-Nazi party and then all the parties of the left which can't get along. The only way in the current Hungarian system that anybody has a chance of beating Orban is if all the opposition parties unite and run one candidate against Fidesz in each district. So they just made that pact. So this summer, including the neo-Nazi party, basically what the liberals said was, okay, in the areas where you're more popular than we are, we'll let you run the one candidate. The liberals don't have a chance of winning, right? And in the areas where we're more popular, like Budapest and the cities and so forth, we'll run our candidate, but we'll enter into a pact to run only one candidate against Fidesz. And then what happens? The next parliamentary session, Orban introduces a legislation, which I think is going to pass this week, that says that in order to get a party list, and whether you run it's like a German system where half the seats are single member districts, half are party list seats, all the money that goes to political parties is attached to whether you run a party list or not. And now he said, this kind of borrows a page from Putin, the only way you can get funding for a party list is if you run individual candidates in at least 52 of the 106 districts. So if a party wants to survive and get funding, they have to run candidates against each other. And that if all it takes is a couple of parties of the 6 to peel off, and then Fidesz wins again. So it's stuff like that, and it's just, it's incredible technical, manipulation of the electoral rules. And then there's the distraction factor, right? Because, Putin is genuinely popular because he took a lot of this when Russia had lots of oil money, and he did really reinvest in rebuilding the medical system, the educational system. My husband's Russian. Like I said, my sister-in-law has better technology in her classroom than most American teachers, and she's in a small school out in Siberia. People see that. So there's a kind of performative quality to leadership. And if you just give people stuff, they support you, that's sort of what democracy is supposed to do, except it's also supposed to allow you to change leaders if you want. And now you see Putin's popularity going down because of the pandemic, and he's hiding and they can't get rid of him. And now it'll be really interesting because his popularity crashed. That's just Putin by himself, but yeah, all the regimes do stuff like this.
Okay, thank you very much. Stuart Field, please.
Hi. In a way, thank you for a wonderful presentation. It was also extremely depressing in many ways, in the sense that there seemed to be, the tide seemed to be running in one particular direction. So I wondered if there were any counterexamples of situations where people had successfully resisted attempts to build authoritarian legalism, either by a form of political resistance, or whether there are sort of particular aspects of constitutional regimes that have proved particularly problematic for such attempts.
Yeah, so it's a really good question. So so there are a couple of cases that I'm looking at more closely in this regard. So one is Ecuador and one is Argentina. So in Ecuador, when Correa came to power, it was clear that he put in place a new constitution, and his new constitution had the right to, what was it called? Like the right to the environment, or, you know, like it was something that got all the attention, while he eliminated the upper chamber of the parliament, did a bunch of other things to remove checks on power. That's how they do this. So Correa was pretty popular, and then he hit a term limit, and he tried to extend his term and put it to a referendum, and the voters said no, sort of supporting my view that voters really don't want autocracy. And actually, what he then did was he pulled a Putin, right, who also hit a term limit. He installed as his successor, you know, put up for election, his handpicked candidate who was going to be carrying on his you know, legacy, Lenin Moreno. So Moreno gets elected, and then Moreno pulls a switch and actually changes the constitution so that Correa can't come back. It's 2 terms total, not 2 terms successive. And suddenly Correa is frozen out by the betrayal of his loyal lieutenant. Okay, so it's a little hard to figure out how you design that into a system, right? But succession is the weak spot of all of of every dictator, right? It's you know, institutionalization of routinization of charisma, right? It's this problem. And so these moments of succession strike me as being good places to focus energies on how you get better succession. So I'm looking at the UK, for example, which I've had, you know, if you read Lord Sumpton's, you know, speech on COVID, I don't always agree with him, but I think that speech is really alarming, right? The extent to which the conventions of British constitutional, of English constitutional, I used to live in Scotland, so I always have to, in Wales, you're sort of, you know, anyway, but yeah, so the sort of norms of Westminster constitutionalism have been run roughshod over in this Brexit process, and now it's continuing in the COVID process. But what's happened, like the Labour Party has actually reconstituted itself. Like in the last election, it was again that problem of just terrible choices, right? I mean, I know lots of people really love Jeremy Corbyn, but lots of traditional Labour voters really didn't. And now the Labour Party is kind of reconstituting itself. The US Democratic Party, I'm not sure, has. The Republican Party is a mess. So sometimes you get like party reconstitution that will put forward options at the next election. And what you hope is that the rules haven't been so rigged in the meantime that that party can't win. So the problem, for example, we're facing in the US, which has really had a lot of tendencies in this direction. You saw that Joe Biden won the national election by almost 8 million more votes than Trump. And yet his victory in the Electoral College really relied on small leads in a bunch of states. So in order to be confident to win a national election in the US, a Democrat has to have at least 5% more of the popular vote going into the election. To get a bare majority in the House of Representatives, the Democrats need about 7% more votes than the Republicans. The Senate now has, you know, 17%, 17% of the US population controls a majority in the Senate. We have minority government in the US, structurally speaking, and the only way that Democrats can win, because it's tilted Republican for various reasons, the only way Democrats can win is by overwhelming with turnout and popularity, you know, this swamping the system. So, you know, how do you get over it? Well, you have to learn how, I mean, in some sense, you play legalistic autocrat back, right? You figure out how the system will work so that you can win it. This may mean weird alliances during elections in order just to get over the hurdles the other parties posed. It may mean, you know, internal party renewal that puts forward a better choice at the next, or a more, you know, consensual choice at the next election. So I'm still thinking that within parties, this is how you do it. And the countries that have sort of bounced back are countries where either there's been, you know, weird idiosyncratic thing like in Ecuador, or party renewal in other states.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. This has been such a lively discussion, such a great talk. I don't want to kill it, but I'm afraid that the Zoom rules allow us only for one more question, and there is a question by Shailesh Kumar. So Shailesh, if I can invite you to the last question of our annual lecture, please. And you have to unmute. You have to unmute, yeah.
Yeah, great.
Thanks for the brilliant lecture, Kim. There were so many questions and issues raised, and I must say, of course, because I'm an Indian and things are developing and so rapidly, especially after the second term, when last year Narendra Modi was re-elected. And as you also mentioned, that the process of re-electing or the process of getting re-elected for all these so-called legal autocrats is again a very kind of interesting. So I have two questions. One is that if people turned populist because of certain reasons, but still if the numbers are saying that they are, they continue to like multiculturalism or they continue to be inclusive, then how does one kind of reconcile this populism and multiculturalism, considering that populism is somewhere produced by the fear of multiculturalism or the fear of being inclusive or the fear of or the threat to identity? So this was the first. And the second question is, when you argue that it's the party collapse rather than the democratic collapse, or it's the main reason is party collapse over and above democratic collapse as the reason for this trend across the globe, then is it not kind of legitimizing the rise of autocratic legalism, and is it not leading to play in the hands of the legal autocrats? Thank you.
Yeah, such a good question. And India is such a fascinating case, right? So, Modi is just the sort of ultimate populist. So there will, any democracy ought to have different ideologies on offer. That's what democratic politics are for, right? So you could also say, how do you reconcile democratic socialism with, property-based conservatism, right? That was the old political spectrum. And this is where you rotate, right? So one group gets to do it for a while, and then the next group gets to undo that and do something else for a while. And democratic contestation is supposed to be about those kinds of differences. And the reason why you want to build in rotations of power is so every group feels like it has a chance to have some moment when its policies are in the foreground, and then the other group mobilizes and wins the next election, right? So that's, in some sense, democracy is premised on the view that people will have different views that can't all be accomplished at the same time. So the way you deal with it is through rotation, right? So I think that's an old problem that democracy was meant to be the solution for. The problem is when you get one of these sides that wins and then digs in, right? So that you don't get rotation of power. That's why I think we talk about this as democratic collapse, because essentially you get locked into one particular, system. So this is where India strikes me as being so interesting, because, India has been a robust democracy, multi-party democracy, but it also had sort of one dominant party for a long time. And in fact, I keep thinking India, South Africa, Russia, these are all cases where in early democratization, there was one big party that stayed in power for a long time, and all the contestations were within the party. Okay, so finally India's over this. It's now got multi-party democracy, but that one big stable Congress, right, has basically collapsed. So in the last election, Modi is up against a shrunken Congress party and then lots of small parties, right? So the party system makes it very difficult to mobilize against Modi, because there's no other party as big and as national as the BJP right now, because Congress fell apart. And Congress fell apart in part because they're rotating the same faces, the same names, right? It became a kind of hereditary succession party. It's all that stuff I talk about when the party itself doesn't renew, and then it collapses. And then it's after you get, so it isn't always the dysfunction isn't always in the party that wins. The dysfunction may be in the party that loses, right? And in particular, what happens is you get one big party that always wins, and then a bunch of smaller parties that fight with each other, which is what I gather the situation now is in India. So Modi's winning in part because the competition is so weak, right? It's not always because I look at some like survey data out of India, which is not perfect, of course, but many people support Modi because they think that he's renewing politics. They don't necessarily support all the attacks on mosques, for example. Just like when people voted for Trump, they liked his tax policy or his judges, but they didn't like all the, his public racism. So we have to kind of avoid thinking that when voters vote for somebody, they believe in everything the person does. I mean, just look at your own voting behavior. Do you approve of everything the candidate you voted for in your last election does? No. So nobody else does either. So the trick is, and this is the genius of democratic politics, is for people to figure out how can we peel voters off, right? By emphasizing the thing that voters held their nose and voted for. And that's what democratic contestation is supposed to do. But if the party system isn't agile enough to do it, then you get these guys, and if they're there long enough, they dig in, and then you can't get rid of them. So that's the dynamic we're seeing. And there's a great piece, what's it called? Death by a Thousand Cuts. It's oh goodness, Tarun Shalish, is that his name? Who just published this piece. I can put a thing in the chat to it, but it's just great going through, it's like sector by sector, how Modi has been deconstructing constitutional government, which he never talks about, and which, you know, 90% of Indians will know nothing about, because constitutional destruction is a little technical. You know, you change the way judges are elected by changing the percentage needed in some body to do whatever. It's that kind of stuff, and it's just not, journalists don't understand it, the public doesn't see it, and I wouldn't think that's what people are voting for.
Thank you very much. There are two more questions or comments. I will just read it quickly. Kyle Smith is making a comment about a strong case for proportionate representation voting systems over winner-takes-all systems. So there may be a question of electoral systems. And Shalish is talking about the nepotism versus self-made politician argument plays a lot too. Yes, we know a lot about it in Czech Republic too. I'm not a politician, I work hard, and Czech Prime Minister, and we could carry on like this. I unfortunately have this horrible road to bring this lecture to its conclusion. I want to
Can I just say one quick thing about electoral system? So here's the problem with proportional representation. It's called the Netherlands. No matter who you vote for, you get the same 6 parties running things, right? And that's a different kind of stagnation. So there's a dilemma in really fractionated systems where you get the same grand coalition and nothing ever changes. So there has to be a possibility in whatever electoral system you have of real change. People have to feel like something is at stake and they can go from one thing to another. And the very fractionated multi-party consensual systems of the Netherlands and the Nordic states are now falling apart. You see this populist challenge precisely because you can change your vote from party A to party A minus, you know, but it doesn't change what the government does. So anyway, sorry, that's just a thing. And yes, it's Tarun at Oxford, and I have to find the reference. So yeah, it's a great piece. It's called Death by a Thousand Cuts. And I will put it in the chat. So
okay, yes. So thanks very much about this lecture, which is a great warning about legality as a technology of power, and even technology leading to the technocracy. I want to thank you all for coming in these exceptional times, because of COVID. We really had the first truly global Center of Law and Society annual lecture. So people joining from all parts of this ill world. I want to thank, I know that I should appropriately thank at the beginning, but the end is always better. I want to thank the Journal of Law and Society for supporting the Center of Law and Society. I want to thank the college, Arts, Humanities and Social Science College of Cardiff University for supporting us, and to all of you for supporting us. Please follow our list of events, our social media. We have more coming, and this at the next academic year. But first of all, I want to thank Kim Lane Scheppele for joining us today, for delivering such a magnificent lecture, which will be recorded and uploaded on our website. And there will be a conversation with Kim Lane Scheppele about her research, her work, which will be recorded next week. So thank you very much, Kim, and we hope to see you soon again. Take care. Bye.
Thanks to everybody. And just feel free to write to me for slides. I'm going to send them to Eugene. You can get them from him too. Thank you so much.
Thank you.